The Jessica Lunsford story. One tragedy, and the law that changed child protection forever. Some stories are remembered for the crime itself. Others are remembered for what they force a society to confront. The story of Jessica Lunsford is both. It is the story of a child whose life was taken because warning signs were missed. And it is the story of how that loss reshaped laws, accountability, and the way the United States tracks and monitors violent offenders. This is not a story about horror. It is a story about failure, responsibility, and reform. This is the Jessica Lunsford story. In February of 2005, Homosassa, Florida was the kind of quiet coastal community where children rode bikes freely and neighbors knew one another by name. It was the kind of place parents believed was safe. Jessica Lunsford was 9 years old. She was energetic, curious, and deeply loved by her family. She enjoyed simple childhood joys, playing outside, spending time with her grandparents, and feeling secure in her home. On the morning of February 24th, Jessica's father, Mark Lunsford, checked on her before leaving the house. She was asleep in her bedroom. Nothing seemed unusual. But later that morning, Jessica was gone. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No alarms triggered. Just an empty bed. When Mark realized his daughter was missing, panic set in immediately. This was not a child who wandered off. This was not a misunderstanding. Law enforcement was contacted within hours. Search teams mobilized quickly. Volunteers flooded the area. Helicopters scanned the landscape. Posters appeared overnight. The community rallied, believing what every parent hopes, that the child would be found alive. But as hours turned into days, fear replaced hope. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood extensively. They interviewed neighbors. They reviewed known offenders in the area. They searched nearby woods, ponds, and abandoned properties. One name eventually surfaced: John Cooey, a convicted sex offender living nearby. Cooey had a criminal history that should have raised alarms. But at the time, critical information was missing from public awareness and law enforcement tracking. He was not properly monitored, and that gap would prove catastrophic. One of the most disturbing revelations in this case was not the crime itself, but what came before it. John Cooey was a registered sex offender. He had served time for violent offenses against children. He lived just blocks from Jessica's home. But he was not listed accurately in public registries. He was not being actively supervised. He had slipped through the cracks. At the time, sex offender tracking laws varied widely by state and county. Information was often outdated, incomplete, or inaccessible. This failure was not isolated. It was systemic. As the search continued, law enforcement focused on Cooey. He was questioned multiple times. His statements were inconsistent. He appeared nervous and evasive. Still, there was not yet enough evidence to arrest him. Meanwhile, Mark Lunsford did something extraordinary. He became the public face of the search. He spoke directly to the media. He pleaded for information. He refused to stop. His grief was visible, but so was his determination. After days of questioning and mounting pressure, John Cooey confessed. What followed was devastating. Jessica had been abducted from her bedroom while she slept. She was taken without a sound being heard, and she did not survive. The details were heartbreaking, but investigators and media chose restraint, focusing instead on accountability and prevention. Jessica's body was recovered. The community was shattered. For many families, grief consumes everything. For Mark Lunsford, grief became fuel. He made a decision that would alter the course of child protection laws in America. He would not allow his daughter's death to be just another statistic. He would force change. As details emerged, one truth became impossible to ignore. This crime was preventable. Cooey's criminal history should have been visible. His proximity to children should have triggered alerts. His lack of supervision should have been addressed. Instead, outdated systems allowed a dangerous offender to live undetected. The failure was not just one man. It was a broken system. Mark Lunsford began meeting with lawmakers. He spoke not with rage, but with clarity. He explained what information was missing, what systems failed, what reforms were necessary. He carried photographs of Jessica with him, not to shock anyone, but to remind lawmakers what was at stake. The result of this advocacy was the Jessica Lunsford Act, passed in Florida in 2005. The law included mandatory minimum sentences for sex offenses against children, lifetime electronic monitoring for repeat offenders, expanded public access to offender information, It was one of the strongest child protection laws in the nation at the time, and it did not stop there. Other states took notice. Versions of Jessica's law were introduced across the United States. By 2006, Congress passed the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, inspired in part by Jessica's case. Together, these laws reshaped sex offender registries, monitoring requirements, interstate data sharing. A patchwork system became more unified. Lives were protected because of it. Not everyone supported the laws without question. Civil rights groups raised concerns about lifetime monitoring, due process, effectiveness versus punishment. These debates were necessary, but they never erased the central truth. Jessica's death exposed a failure that demanded action. In the years following the reforms, offender tracking improved. Information became more accessible. Law enforcement coordination increased. While no law can prevent all crime, evidence showed increased accountability and awareness. Jessica's name became synonymous with vigilance. Mark Lunsford continued advocacy long after the laws passed. He founded organizations. He spoke nationally. He helped other families navigate loss and reform. He ensured Jessica would be remembered not only for how she died, but for what her life changed. Jessica Lunsford was not a symbol. She was a child who loved her family, who trusted her world, who deserved safety. Her story reminds us that systems exist to protect the most vulnerable, and when they fail, consequences are irreversible. Today, child protection laws continue to evolve. Technology improves. Databases expand. Oversight strengthens. But vigilance remains essential. Jessica's story teaches us that prevention depends on accurate information, accountability, public awareness, and the courage to act before tragedy strikes. The Jessica Lunsford story is not just about a crime. It is about responsibility. It is about what happens when a father refuses to accept silence. And it is proof that even the deepest loss can lead to life-saving change. This was the Jessica Lunsford story, a tragedy that exposed failure and created reform that protects children to this day. If you want more investigative true crime stories focused on understanding, accountability, and prevention, subscribe to Mystery Grid. Because every story is a puzzle, and some puzzles exist to make sure history never repeats itself.